Hi, and welcome to the first in a series of tutorials on Introductory React. The idea behind this series of tutorials is to focus on students who are maybe self-taught, self-learners, and are coming to React as their first JavaScript framework in web development. Um, if you're new to web development and you're learning React as your first framework, this is kind of the way that I approached React as well. And so hopefully I can offer that perspective of someone who's coming from the same place that you are, who has the same experience level that you do. There are a ton of tutorials out there on React. There's some really great ones that I'll be recommending throughout this series as we come upon different topics. But one thing that they all tend to have in common is that they are developed by really experienced web developers who have learned React after many, many years in the field, many years of experience, and are approaching React from the mindset of seeing all of the problems that React has set out to solve that they faced over their many years of experience. But I think if you're like me and you're coming to React after kind of just having learned basic web development through HTML, CSS, and vanilla JavaScript, a lot of these problems aren't necessarily apparent yet, and so React can seem kind of more complicated maybe than it's worth. And so hopefully this tutorial series can offer the perspective of someone who's kind of had to approach it from that viewpoint and work through those problems in kind of a different manner. So if you find it useful, that's awesome. If not, let me know and I'll try and rework some of these things to better suit folks out there who are coming to it kind of from the self-learner perspective. So anyways, to get started in React for our very first React project, we're going to talk about the kind of core concept of React, which are components. So to get started, we need to make sure that we have a package manager installed. I use npm. There's also Yarn out there, which is great. If you don't have npm installed, you can just go to their site, just even Google searching npm install and do that real quick. Once that's all set up, I'm on Windows, so I use the Node.js command prompt. There are other options out there for Mac as well. And once we're all set to go with that, we need to create our React app. Now you can set up a React app kind of by hand, so to speak, which a lot of folks do, but it takes a lot of time to learn how to do that properly. And I think for someone who's just starting to learn how to use React and starting to learn how to use it to create their own kind of, introductory basic projects, Create React App is kind of the best way to go. It's a really powerful tool that the React developers have given us, and it allows us to install all of the stuff that a React app needs to function with one single command. So I'm going to go ahead and cd to the desktop here, if I could spell correctly. There we go. And I'm going to run this command create React app, and then I'm going to specify the directory that I want to create it to. If I found that if you create the directory in Windows first and then create React app in that directory, it causes one small issue that's pretty easy to fix later, but I think it's better just to avoid it altogether. I'm not sure if it's different in the way that Mac file systems work, but on Windows at least, I think it's best to let create React app actually create the directory for you that you want. So on desktop, I haven't created my directory yet, so I'm just going to say create React app and then say my first React project, right? Something like that. And then hit enter, and this is going to run a bunch of stuff. It's going to install a bunch of dependencies and packages from the internet, and then it should all be set up and ready to go. I've already run this already because my computer is incredibly slow. If you have even a slightly newer computer than mine, I have 4 gigs of RAM and a Core i3 processor from 7 years ago. So if you have even a slightly newer, faster computer than mine, this shouldn't be a problem at all. It takes about 10 minutes on my computer. So if you are like me and you're coming from a place where you haven't been able to invest in nicer technology yet, and you still want to learn this, just be aware that you're probably going to want to hit this command and then be able to walk away and do something else for about 10 minutes and then come back, and it should be all set up and ready to go. So we've run our command. It's going to install all of our packages, and then we're going to open it up in VS Code. So we're going to come down to our terminal in VS Code here, and we have to run a development server in React. So the way that React works is essentially it allows us to write our HTML in our JavaScript files. For a lot of folks, I think, who have been in web development for many years, this was kind of a strange concept because they had spent a lot of time trying to get their JavaScript out of their HTML files. If you're like me and you're coming to this from a newer perspective, this maybe won't be that strange, and it's actually kind of nice to be able to have everything all in one place. So in order to do that, it uses something called JSX, which is how we write the HTML markup in our JavaScript, and then it uses Babel, which translates that into actual HTML and then applies that to your site. So we have to run a development server in order for Babel to work. So we use the command, and I've already run this as well because, again, my computer is very slow and it takes a little while to do it. But in npm, it's just npm start, right? Just npm start and hit enter, and that will start up your development server. If you're using Yarn, it's yarn start, but it's quite simple. And I'll show you that command up here. There it is, npm start, right? And once that has started, it will say the development server is running. It will remind you that if you want to run a production build, you use npm run build. We won't worry about that right now. And then we're going to open up our favorite browser. I prefer Firefox, but I've taken to using Chrome when I'm developing React apps because the Chrome developer tools for React are super powerful. So we'll open up Chrome and we'll go to localhost 3000 and we will see our React app here. All set up and ready to go for us. So this is just some basic markup and styling that the React creators give us through Create React App so that we can see kind of the basics of what's going on. So you'll see down here it says edit source/app.js and save to reload. So we'll talk about that in a second. And then there's a link here to reactjs.org, which is the React documentation, which is a lot to read and take in, but it's definitely worth going through and reading that as you start to think about what's going on. So we have our app.js file in our source. So we have two main folders here. We have source and we have public. In public, we have our one solitary HTML file. This is the only HTML file you need in React, which is pretty cool. And we have links to some of the logos and icons that they give us, which isn't too important right now. But then down here in our body, right, we see we have one single solitary div tag with the ID of root. And in the language here, it tells you this HTML file is a template. If you open it directly in the browser, you'll see an empty page. So how do we actually write our HTML to our HTML file? So we go into our source and we have a complementary file here, index.js. So here we have a bunch of imports, which we'll talk about in a second. And then we have this command here, react dom.render. So obviously, if you are used to working in vanilla JavaScript, you're used to the DOM, right? Writing to the DOM. And we do that through our document.getElementById call, and we get the ID of root, which is that root div in our index.html file. And what this is basically saying is, to the React DOM, to this ID root, we're going to render our, and actually let me clean this up real quick. We're going to render our app component, right? So this is taking everything that is in our app component and rendering it to our index.html file, to that root div. So what is a component? Well, let's go into app.js and find out. So here we go. So we have our function app, and then this returns a bunch of classic HTML markup. This is our JSX. This is our HTML markup. And in here, we can write any sort of HTML markup that we want to. Babel then compiles this into React functions. And a lot of tutorials that I've taken on React kind of get into the weeds with how these React functions work. They want you to see what's happening under the hood, how React is actually turning this into HTML, rendering that out to your HTML file. I don't know that that's especially important for those who are like me, who are just kind of beginning out, because I think from a common sense perspective, at least for me, this really doesn't raise that many red flags. I mean, it's a little strange seeing this in your JavaScript, but this is just HTML markup. You have a function, right? And just like a function in vanilla JavaScript is some reusable code that can take arguments and return different values based upon the conditions that you set forth in that function. And then you can call that function wherever you want to with whatever you want to pass in as those arguments. In the same way, a component is just a reusable bit of HTML markup. Now, components can get a lot more complicated than this, and you can still write actual JavaScript within here, and we'll get into that as well in later parts of the tutorial. But for now, the way that we're going to work with components is just as their kind of most basic form, which is just some reusable HTML markup that we can render wherever we want to. So in order to render it out, we have to export it out of this JavaScript file. And then in index.js, we import that app component from our app.js file. And then we render it down here just as an HTML tag. So every component gets its own unique HTML tag that you can use. And we can actually render this as many times as we want to, right? So we have one app here, and then we have one app component below that. So the first one is going to return, it's going to render all of this HTML markup, our div with the class name of app, our header, our p tag, our link tag, right? So that's all right here. And then we're rendering that a second time. And so if we scroll down, we see it again down here, right below it, right? So whatever is in this app component is always going to get rendered out. So let's change this up a little bit. Let's clean this up. Actually, let's get rid of everything in here. So the one trick that you want to always remember is that just like in vanilla JavaScript, with your return statement, you get one thing, right? You can't return a bunch of different things. You can return an object with different values in it. You can return an array with different values in it, but you can't return a bunch of different things. And so in the same way, you can only return one root element. You can return as much markup as you want to in here, but you could not return something like, say, an h1, and then a p tag below that, and then our a tag below that, right? And our linter is actually going to catch this right away, and it's going to say JSX expressions must have one parent element. So we can have all this stuff, but we have to wrap it in a parent element like div id equals parent, right? So once we wrap all this stuff in our parent div, then we are good to go. Okay, and it's still going to give me some underlines from the linter because it's got to have content that's accessible by a screen reader. That's an accessibility thing. So it's kind of a nice deal with the linter too here, is that it reminds us that we need to have accessibility. But anyways, it's gotten rid of the underlines telling us that we need to have one parent element. React now gives us something really cool that we can do, because obviously divs can change the styling based upon whether you call this a div or a section or whatever you want it to be. So you can actually return all of this inside one empty parent element, which does absolutely nothing to the styling, but it just acts as your main overarching container that can contain all of your markup. So in this header tag, we say welcome. And then in our p tag, we'll say hello world. And let's not worry about a link tag for right now. So we'll get rid of that. We'll save. It's going to recompile. And once that is all set, we should be able to open up our app again. And there we have it. Welcome hello world, welcome hello world. That's because we're still rendering out to app components here. So we'll get rid of our second app component and we'll refresh. This is one of the reasons that I like using Firefox. It's a little more responsive to your saves and auto refreshing. But there we see we have our welcome, we have our h1 tag, and we have our p tag there. Very cool. So to recap, we have one solitary HTML file with one solitary HTML element in our body with our ID of root. That's in our public folder. In our source folder is all the stuff that we're actually going to have on the website. On our index.js file, we just have our React DOM render command. We're grabbing that element, the root element, and we're rendering app to that. Index.html, you can clean up some of this stuff in here if you don't need the React icons or any of that stuff. You can clean up that. But otherwise, I would not bother touching the index.html file. I would not bother touching the index.js file. The thing that we're really going to worry about is our app.js file. So this is our kind of first overarching main component, and we export that into our index.js file, and then we can create our app from here. Now, let's say we wanted to have more components, right? We want to have multiple pages for our website, and we're going to end up having a lot of stuff in this one app.js file. So that's where our components come in, and we'll talk more about components in the next section of this tutorial.